2 months before the 2024 election, Putin weighed in on his preferred candidate. With a smirk, he endorsed Kamala Harris, partly because of her expressive laugh. That, of course, is disinformation. Behind the scenes, Putin's regime has been actively, but ineptly, interfering in the US election, fantasizing about a Trump victory. In fact, in 2024, the Kremlin is more definitively pro-Trump than they were in 2016. In 2016, the Kremlin didn't directly back Trump to win, if only because they felt he couldn't. They thought the best they could get was a weakened Hillary. Now, in 2024, Putin backs Trump absolutely as an agent of chaos and ungovernability in the US, and as an agent for bringing about an end to the Ukraine war without Western security guarantees for Ukraine. So let's do Trump first and Kamala Harris second. There are 3 things on a personal level that Putin thinks of Donald Trump. Number 1, Putin thinks that Trump is ethically and ideologically bankrupt. Number 2, Putin thinks Trump doesn't have the analytical skills to come to terms with the complexity of the situation in Ukraine, in Russia, in global politics. And the third thing Putin thinks is that Trump's ultimately in pursuit of fame, power, and the protection power might give him from prosecution. Putin knows that Trump does not have a new vision to offer for the United States. He sees that Trump is a destructive politician who represents millions of voters who have lost trust in a political system that they find opaque, and they want to chuck a giant orange wrecking ball at it. And this rudderlessness of Trump's worries Putin. Putin knows that in his first term, Trump failed to form an elite around him and got co-opted into a lot of establishment policy making. Putin is encouraged by Project 2025 and by Trump saying that he would try to do more to break the system a second time round. But Putin remains skeptically hopeful, which means his endorsement of Trump is clear, but it's not over the moon euphoric. Let's jump to Kamala Harris now. To understand how Putin feels about Kamala Harris, you've got to realize that Putin sees the United States today as a kind of version of late-stage Soviet Union. That's to say, he sees it as a malfunctioning political system that is grinding to a halt, is facing a legitimacy crisis, and that has elites that are simply unable to generate solutions to the country's problems. For Putin, the transition from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris wasn't a democratic transition, but a kind of illustration of what looks to him like an old-style Soviet Politburo machination. He sees it as an illustration of the fakeness of Western democracy. There you have a President of the United States with cognitive decline. Then in come a bunch of elites like Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama. They do some things behind the scenes, and then suddenly there emerges a woman who was just a regular vice president and is presented as a kind of national leader. Now, Putin's vastly and in a paranoid way exaggerating this. We know, of course, he has a point, but he's vastly exaggerating this. And he thinks that this is proof that US democracy is fake. And of course, Putin has to exaggerate this because his entire theory of victory over us lies where? It doesn't lie in Ukraine, it lies in our capitals and in our parliament, right? Because it's only that if Western democracies continue to decline that Putin can win his war against the West that is currently taking place in Ukraine. And that's why the flaws and sillinesses of our democracy, which don't contradict the fact that we still have one, look to him as incontrovertible evidence of the fact that it doesn't exist. Putin's personal response to Kamala Harris is quite interesting, I think. He's going to be more troubled, in my assessment, by her being a woman than by the color of her skin. Putin's actually less personally prejudiced than the extraordinarily tyrannical policies of his regime toward sexual and gender minorities, for example, would indicate. But he can be insecure and triggered by women, and he actually has a trauma about an American woman, and that is Hillary Clinton. In 2011, there were the famous protests all over Moscow, and Putin blamed them on Hillary Clinton. He was triggered by the fact that these protests were facilitated by Western influence and were approved of by Hillary Clinton, who talked about the illegitimacy of the recent elections. And Putin said, let me quote, that Hillary's statements were a signal to demonstrators who were working, quote, with the support of the US State Department. So don't forget, Putin thinks all protest and revolution must be an expression of malign foreign interference. He can face no domestic opposition, and he has this theory that revolutions are never authentic, they're always projections of enemy power inside the territory of a country. And this gets worse, because Hillary is also associated with the paradigmatic terror phobia image that Putin has, which is the demise of Gaddafi, right? It's partly to avoid that demise that Putin invaded Ukraine. And all of that is associated with an American woman, and there's no way that that's not going to be partly projected onto Kamala Harris. So basically, Putin is going to be both triggered by Kamala Harris and see her as a kind of incidental, kind of a female politician with incidental power as a result of some kind of elite machination. But let's now turn to what Putin wants to happen immediately in the aftermath of the election. In the aftermath of the election, what Putin wants is a situation where the election takes a long time to call, and it looks close, and there is tremendous opportunity for Trump to spread disinformation about the outcome of the result. Because, of course, in a democracy, everything depends, right, on me, the loser, admitting the legitimacy of the outcome if you've won against me, right? And Trump undermining that in the days immediately after the election is something that Putin would be in love with. And that creates a difficult situation for you, because you've got to balance dealing with the fact that your political opponents, if you're in the United States, are calling you enemies within, without responding by simply perpetuating that enemies within discourse, even if you recognize that democratic institutions are being outrageously challenged and that maybe some elements of the Trump campaign are peddling Russian propaganda. A difficult balance for you to handle. And now we come to the issue of Russian interference. Are the Russians interfering in the US election 2024? Absolutely. It has been Russian state policy to interfere in those democracies that have been implicated in the sanctions regime against Russia since 2014. For instance, the infamous doppelganger Russian disinformation campaign resurfaced again in September 2024. And that's where they clone entire websites and then populate them with memes and fake news of various kinds. And the aim of that is not to take particular sides in political conflicts within the United States, but to promote toxicity, chaos, and civic strife. So how should we Western citizens, and in particular American citizens, react to this? I think there are three things we need to do. The first is we've got to distinguish the degree of Russian activity as they try to interfere in our democracies from the efficacy of that activity. Don't confuse action with effectiveness, and do not underestimate the resplendent capacity the Russians have for unbelievable ineptitude in their active measures against us. The second thing we've got to do is realize that the Russians are trying to weaponize you against your own democracy. That's to say, the interference is meant to have a double effect. The first effect is the harm of the interference itself. But the second effect is the harm of your fear about the interference, your reaction to it, your overreaction to it, and how that might inadvertently lead you to deepen polarization in your own democracy. As Thomas Rid, who is a brilliant expert, says, the biggest boost for the doppelganger campaign was actually the West's own anxious coverage, highlighting the need for new strategies to combat disinformation. So there are two things that could go wrong here. First is we could simply over-highlight the Russian disinformation, giving it more oxygen and actually allowing people to fall for it who might otherwise not have seen it. But the second thing is that we might too prematurely jump to calling our political opponents at home foreign assets or enemies within, just deepening polarization in our society and ironically making us more receptive for malign Russian interference in the future. And the third thing we've got to do is culture ourselves into understanding the mechanisms and objectives of post-truth Russian propaganda. Doing that is not Russian studies, it's actually just about making us effective citizens in our democracies. And to learn about that, watch my video on the fundamentals of Russian propaganda if you haven't already.